200 years after her death, why are people still so obsessed with Jane Austen? Deborah Yaffe will join us to talk about her book, Among the Janeites, A Journey Through the World of Jane Austen Fandom.
I think the thing that's special about Jane Austen for me is that I found this community of people around Jane Austen.
What makes Scandinavia seem so appealing? Robert Ferguson will join us from Oslo to discuss his new book, Scandinavians, In Search of the Soul of the North.
During and even in the very earliest stages of the Viking era, they were very clear of the fact that they were Danes, Swedes, and Norwegians.
Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Deborah Yaffe joins us now. Her book is called Among the Janeites, A Journey Through the World of Jane Austen Fandom, and it's part of an essay review of several books on Jane Austen that Jane Smiley writes this week for the New York Times Book Review's Jane Austen issue. Deborah, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So you wrote this book 4 years ago. It's still in print, and there is renewed interest, of course, because we are coming upon the
bicentennial of Jane Austen's death next Tuesday.
And we were talking about this. What do we say? We don't celebrate her death.
No, she died at 41 of a mysterious illness that we're still not sure what it was. And she was at the height of her powers. And so her death is incredibly sad. So I've been opting to use the word commemorating her death rather than celebrating her death.
And when her death anniversary passes, is there a mournful tone as opposed to the anniversary of Pride and Prejudice, for example?
Well, I guess I would say that people are sort of torn between noting how sad it was that she died in such an untimely way, but also celebrating what her life and her works brought to us, because she did create, in my opinion, 6 of the greatest works in English literature, and that's an amazing and wonderful gift that keeps giving to all of us 200 years later.
Let's go to your title and the word Janeite. What does that mean? What is a Janeite?
The name Janeites was coined in the late 19th century by a Victorian literary critic named George Saintsbury, and he intended it in a sort of a fond but maybe slightly mocking way to refer to the people who were really, really nuts about Jane Austen, and he included himself in that number. Over the years, it has acquired in some corners a slightly mocking or derisive tone. Janeites are sometimes caricatured as kind of tea-drinking spinster librarians who knit and sit around talking about Jane Austen. But a lot of contemporary Jane Austen fans kind of embrace that name as a badge of honor, and
it's like
I
the
certainly
slut
do.
of Jane Austen.
There you go.
Literary.
We're Jane Austen sluts, exactly. So I certainly embrace it. I think it's kind of a fun name, and it seemed like a good choice for identifying the kinds of people that I was writing about in Among the Janeites, who are basically completely obsessed with Jane Austen.
Okay, I want to get to Janeites in a second, but I'm interested in that slightly derogatory tone. I mean, what's the reason behind that dismissiveness of Jane Austen, who I think is pretty universally acknowledged to be one of the great English authors?
And good job on that little Pride and Prejudice reference.
There we go. We'll try to. We'll just slip them in on occasion here.
There you go. I think that it's not so much a derisive attitude towards Jane Austen, who, as you say, is pretty much universally agreed to be a member of the pantheon of English novelists. I think that there's a derisive attitude towards fandom. In general, to some extent. I mean, people kind of mock at Trekkies and Star Wars fans and that kind of thing, too. But I do think that there's a sexist tone to this.
I was going to say.
Jane Austen fans now, this was not so much true historically, but nowadays Jane Austen fans, the kinds of people who go to the big Jane Austen conferences and dress up in Regency costume and dance at the balls, tend to be women and tend to be middle-aged women. And
who are their dancing partners at the
sometimes
balls?
Other middle-aged women. Sometimes they're compliant husbands and boyfriends who they have dragged along. And of course there are male Janeites as well. It's not a universally female phenomenon. But it's not hard for people to mock middle-aged women dressing up and sort of throwing themselves wholeheartedly into an enthusiasm. And I also do think that over the years there has been, although it's not so much true now, there has historically been a little bit of a condescending attitude even towards Jane Austen, who was sometimes thought of as this kind of sweet little maiden aunt penning these charming little tales of rural life that weren't very challenging but were kind of sweet and diverting. People nowadays, I think, are much more understanding of the really sharp, ironic and sarcastic tone to a lot of what she writes. But so historically there was that somewhat trivializing attitude towards Austen, and then it's easy to transfer that to a trivializing attitude towards her female fans.
When did that shift occur in terms of the critical reception from looking at her as a kind of quaint female novelist to recognizing the fact that a lot of this was satirical?
There's really, I think, maybe two inflection points. In the 40s, there's an essay called Regulated Hatred by D.W. Harding. And that's an essay that for maybe the first, not really the first time, but for maybe a prominent time, highlights some of the aspects of Jane Austen that are much tougher and not nearly as reassuring as the traditional picture of her. And then in the 70s, with the advent of feminist literary criticism, there's certainly a lot more attention to the ways in which Austen is subversive, is possibly a critic of her society and of the gender relations in her society and the economic relations in her society. But I would say all along, there have always been people who could see that in Jane Austen. Even in the 19th century, Margaret Oliphant, who is a writer, writes an essay about Jane Austen where she talks about her fine vein of feminine cynicism. So there have always been people who saw that, just sort of the prevailing view maybe tended to be a little more rose-colored in the past.
Right. So it was more about an argument that occurred maybe within academia and the sort of literary criticism than in the popular.
Yeah, it's hard to say because there hasn't been as much attention to the popular tone of fandom as maybe there could be. Another book in the same essay that mine is in this week is about a book by Devaney Lozer called The Making of Jane Austen, which talks about the fan reception of Jane Austen in much earlier times. And it's interesting to see the extent to which there were plenty of people who saw Jane Austen as writing really strong women who stood up against prevailing currents in their society and insisted on getting things for themselves that they were entitled to. So there clearly have been fans who saw that as well. But whether if you stopped somebody on the street and asked them about Jane Austen, first of all, whether they would have any thoughts about her at all is a question. But, if they had any, they might, especially nowadays, be influenced very much by the movies of Jane Austen's books.
Right.
And, and that would be kind of sweet, rose-tinted romance novel kinds of an impression of her.
Let's go to the timeline of not Jane Austen, but Janeites. I mean, when did her base of fans, did it exist during her lifetime? Did it start soon thereafter?
Well, certainly not really during her lifetime because she published anonymously. Her identity was not officially publicly known until after she had died. And her books actually went out of print after her death for maybe 10 years or so, and then came back into print in the 1830s. Usually the conventional wisdom is to say that in 1870, her nephew, James Edward Austen Leigh, who had known her when he was a teenager and then by this time was in his 70s, decided to publish a collection of family reminiscences of Jane Austen, the memoir of Jane Austen. And this definitely promulgated the view of her as kind of the sweet maiden aunt who, was very domestic and also wrote these little books on the side. And this book was wildly popular. And it really did create a new interest in Jane Austen and in her novels, even though they had certainly been in print and had been being read for about 30 or 40 years before that. That's when Jane Austen really started to develop a fan base. And then as English literature became part of the university curriculum over the next decades, she eventually became part of that as well. And then, of course, contemporary Jane Austen fandom, often we tend to date from the 1995 BBC production of Pride and Prejudice.
I was going to say, yes. How much has Colin Firth responsible for this movement?
Yeah, Colin Firth does have a lot to answer for. And specifically, often is mentioned the scene in which Colin Firth's Mr. Darcy emerges from a lake in a dripping white wet shirt, clinging provocatively to his manly chest. That's often seen as being, I describe it in Among the Janeites as kind of the big bang of contemporary Austen fandom. It's kind of the moment that a lot of people simultaneously saw Jane Austen as this exciting, vital, sexy writer. And also, I think this is important, the internet was just getting started right around the same time. So they were also able to talk to each other about how they felt about this. And that is a way of really keeping fandom going.
Has Colin Firth ever been to Jasna? And tell us what Jasna is.
So Jasna is the Jane Austen Society of North America, which was founded in, I'm trying to remember now, 1979, I think. And it's an organization of Janeites in the United States and Canada. As far as I know, Colin Firth has never attended a JASNA meeting. There's an annual meeting held in a different American or Canadian city every year. Were he ever to attend, I'm not sure that, the universe could hold the amount of energy that would
Pandemonium.
Who did attend is in the 2011 AGM, which was held in Texas. Andrew Davis, who's the screenwriter of that BBC Pride and Prejudice and also of a number of other Jane Austen adaptations, he did attend. And, he's at that point, like a 70-year-old white-haired screenwriter, and the Janeites in attendance treated him like a rock star. He literally, had groupies who, accompanied him to the bar after the ball in order to, talk more about Jane Austen.
So there's a massive Jane Austen fan base here in the U.S. and then, of course, in the UK as well. And I don't know if there are similarities, if they compete with each other, if they correspond, if there are world Jane Austen sort of fan organizations. How does this work?
There are definitely other Jane Austen organizations around the world. Australia has a big one, and then there are smaller groups in Brazil and in a number of European countries. The Jane Austen Society of Britain is the first one. It was founded in the 1940s during World War II with a specific mission of saving the house that Jane Austen had spent the last 8 years of her life in, which is Chawton Cottage. It's a relatively small house in Hampshire in southern England. They wanted to make sure that it was preserved for the nation, and it is indeed now a museum of Jane Austen's life. So the Jane Austen Society of the UK was essentially existed for about 35 years before the founding of the American Jane Austen Society. The UK Jane Austen Society historically tended to be much more sort of decorous and academic.
More conservative.
Yes, more British than the American one, and they'd have this annual meeting on the lawn at Chawton, and people would drink tea and eat scones and listen to some academic papers on Jane Austen, and then they would go home, and they published a newsletter. And Americans were allowed to join if they wanted to, but they would have had to come to England to go to an event. And a couple of American Janeites met each other at the bicentennial of Jane Austen's birth, which was 1975, and decided that they wanted to found an American version of the society. And the American society is now larger than the British one.
Wow. So next week is the 200th anniversary of her death, death-iversary, I guess. Are those very special occasions? There are annual meetings, right, of JASNA?
Yeah.
But I'm assuming that this is going to be a big one this year.
The annual meeting is not in July. The annual meeting is in usually September, October. And this year, the theme of the meeting, it's being held in California, and the theme is Jane Austen in Paradise. So it's obviously picking up on the fact that she is no longer with us and has gone to her eternal reward. But it's not specifically about her death. It's about her legacy and that kind of thing. But a lot of local Jane Austen chapters, there's regional groups of the Jane Austen Society, and they are certainly organizing events. And my own in central New Jersey is, in fact, organizing a special event coming up this Sunday where we're going to do some dramatic readings from Jane Austen's work, and we're going to read the epitaph written on her grave in Winchester Cathedral, and we're going to eat cake and toast her and all that kind of thing. So I'm sure other groups are doing that kind of thing.
Do you consider yourself a Janeite?
Oh, certainly.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And what's your particular fascination? Is there one novel that obsesses you or some aspect of her writing or life?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I have a lot of authors that I love. I think the thing that's special about Jane Austen for me is that I found this community of people around Jane Austen. And so being able to share something you love with people who feel similarly strongly about it is a very kind of special and empowering kind of experience. And so that's probably what has made me a Janeite in that sense. I mean, there's many things I love about her works, and I can't say that I have one in particular that especially fascinates me. But I just think that she's the kind of writer who every time you read her, you find new things in her pages. And that means that it's never boring to go back to a book that you've read before, even though you know how it's going to end and who's going to marry who at the end. You'll be reading along and a sentence will strike you and you will think, I never noticed that before, and what an amazing sentence that is, or what an amazing perceptiveness about human nature that is.
Well, before we end, I want to get back to the heart of Jane Austen, which of course is her work. Which of her novels is your personal favorite?
I usually have to say it's the one I just read most recently, but if I were to go to a desert island, I would probably take Persuasion with me, but I would spend much of my time on the island lamenting that I had not also been able to bring Pride and Prejudice and Emma. So that's my Weasley answer.
All right. Well, I'm gonna make you get a little more specific than that. Why Persuasion?
For me, Persuasion, which is the last novel that she finished before she died, is the most emotionally intense and emotionally mature of her novels. It's about a relationship between two people who were in love 8 years before and for various reasons broke up and now meet again 8 years later and rediscover their feelings for each other. And it's a book about second chances and regrets and trying to think about your life in a longer-term perspective and figure out what's important to you now that might not have been important to you once. And I think these are themes that really resonate with a lot of people, especially as they get older. It's the kind of book I always say that, women over 30 especially can relate to in a certain way. Even if you haven't had a lost love, you've had a lost something. So that, I think, is why it's my favorite.
Well, it feels like it's one of those novels that's ripe for periodic rereading.
Oh, always.
Which is always a good thing. Deborah, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
Deborah Yaffe is the author of Among the Janeites, A Journey Through the World of Jane Austen Fandom, and she also blogs twice weekly about Jane Austen on her blog, which is, what's the URL?
The address of the website is deborahjaffe.com.
All right then. Deborah, thanks again.
Thank you.
Robert Ferguson joins us now from Oslo. His new book is called Scandinavians, In Search of the Soul of the North. Robert, thanks for being here.
It is my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
So you are in Oslo, but you are not originally of Oslo. How long have you been in Norway, and where did you move there from?
Well, I'm British by birth, and I came here late in 1983. And I came here on a one-year scholarship from the Norwegian government. And in the course of that year, I met the woman I married, who was a Norwegian, of course. And really by that kind of accident, rather than by design, I've ended up living most of my adult life here.
Do you feel at this point somewhat Scandinavian?
Well, I do. You can't really help it after so many years. It sort of seeps into you. I'm still a British citizen with a British passport. But one of the things I mentioned in the last chapter of the book really is I describe a famous football match that was played between England and Norway back in the 80s, when Norway was very much a minnow in the world of football. And I watched that game on television, and much to my surprise, I found that I was cheering for both sides, which you're not supposed to do. But I couldn't help it. It was a very odd experience, but not unpleasant at all. It was nice to think that I was that much of a Norwegian. And
it's interesting. I feel like your accent is no longer a purely British accent, but you have that Scandinavian inflection.
It's possible, I've heard that before, and I always think, well, how can that possibly be? Because I spent so many years of my life in England. My English accent is very slightly Northern English, but I'm sure that because I speak so much Norwegian here on a daily basis, Norwegian language has a kind of tonal inflection, the words rise and fall and the sentences rise and fall much more than in English, British or American English. Some of that may have just smitten over into the way I speak English. Of course, one never knows, one doesn't have that kind of self-consciousness about one's own language, but I simply have to believe it if people tell me I speak with a slight accent. I take it as a compliment.
Is it because you straddle these two cultures and you live in a culture that is not your own of birth that you decided to write a book about this search for the soul of the North, as your subtitle puts it?
I think it is, in a sense, one is in the world but not of it. I often reflect on the fact I see small Norwegian boys of girls of about 10, or 5 or 6, and I think they're more Norwegian than I will ever be, even though I've lived here for over 30 years. So one's always a sort of outsider. That helps in a way. I think it helps to give you a kind of distance, to give you a kind of objectivity when you're trying to understand the culture, the history of the culture, how the culture developed into its current state. One quite specific reason why I wrote this book is that my previous book was a history of the Vikings. I ended my Viking age at about the year 1100 with the arrival of institutionalized Christianity in Scandinavia. That's a new way of measuring time. It's a new way of writing the language. It's new names for the constellations in the night sky. Everything changes, a sort of massive cultural watershed, new gods, new religion. In a sense, my interest after that was, well, what happened next? How should one describe the next 1,000 years? And that was such a massive task that I thought I can't possibly do that the rest of my life wouldn't be long enough. So what I did in Scandinavians is write a sort of series of almost micro-histories, like stepping stones through the last 1,000 years of Scandinavian history.
Is it with the coming of Christianity that idea of Scandinavia as an area, as a culture, as a way of being begins?
Even before that, they had a very clear idea of who they were during and even in the very earliest stages of the Viking era. They were very clear of the fact that they were Danes, Swedes, and Norwegians, and even the geographical sizes of those countries were not dissimilar to what they are now. I suppose the main difference would be that what is now Skåne in southern Sweden was for centuries literally, a part of Denmark, because Denmark was the regional superpower for many, many centuries.
I'm curious about the concept of Scandinavia when there are, as you mentioned, 3 very distinct countries that are part of it. Is it like Canada and America, where Canadians get very annoyed sort of being linked together with Americans as sort of North Americans, or Midwesterners feel weird being lumped in with New Yorkers?
This is exactly the same sort of thing. The outside world tends to look at Scandinavia and think basically it's just one region divided into 3 separate geographical entities. And there are many similarities. The languages are very close. You can't necessarily understand all 3 when you hear them spoken, but if you can read one, you can read all 3. They're very well aware of the fact that they are individual nations, different, and they don't like to at all to be confused with each other. And they have their own long and often quite violent history over the last 1,000 years. I mean, Sweden and Denmark, Norway, as it was for so many centuries, they were at war with each other for, I think, almost 126 years if you add them up together, from about the late 13th century.
And yet, for outsiders, I think, first of all, the idea that 2 of these nations have been at war with each other, or had been at war with each other for long periods of time, is very surprising, since we sort of imagine things as being in this kind of IKEA furniture-filled cool bliss. But I think even outsiders here are surprised that Finland isn't part of it. It's our idea of the geographic borders in this whole area is probably quite nebulous.
I think the basic distinction most people observe, the basic convenience most people observe, is that Scandinavia is a linguistic community in the sense that I was talking about earlier, that it's all basically regional variations of the same language, whereas Finland is Finno-Ugric. It's a completely different language, totally impenetrable to Danes, Swedes, and Norwegians.
What else do the Scandinavians have in common, though, beyond the language?
One of the things that interested me in writing that book is the way that, literally for centuries, the outside world has always looked upon Scandinavians as almost as the official purveyors of melancholy to the rest of the world. And very, very recently, all 3 nations have been appearing in the top 10 of the happiest people in the world.
It's so curious because it feels so recent. I mean, I think back to the 1990s, not that long ago, when I was in college, I took a course in Nordic culture that was, it was Strindberg and Ibsen, Munch, and Ingmar Bergman, the filmmaker, and no one would accuse their work of being cheerful in any way. It was quite distinctly about this melancholic culture. So how did it get from that to happiness in a few short decades? Did our perception change, or did something change in Scandinavia?
I think the first point I would make is that those people were, for want of a better word, geniuses. They were not actually typical Scandinavians. But in the days before the internet and the mass media and cheap air travel and so on, art was the only way that countries and peoples got to know about each other. So that when people saw Ibsen's plays or Munch's paintings or even Bergman's films, they took that as being somehow representative of the culture, whereas in many ways they don't represent the culture. They as I say, they're the work of exceptional people within. In many ways, I think what we call these cultures very conformist, and these people were very non-conformist. And then suddenly you get the internet, you get the mass media, you get television, you get cheap air travel, you get IKEA, you get ABBA, and the whole thing is turned upside down. But what I wanted to do in that book was pay due respect to that tradition of melancholy, because it goes back even further than that, the 1890s. It goes back really to Hamlet, the gloomy Dane, who of course wasn't a real person, but I think it had a profound influence on the way people outside Scandinavia thought about Scandinavia. I sense that this is a passing phenomenon, and I like to think that the greater profundity of melancholy will survive it.
We'll all go back to thinking about Scandinavia as melancholy, and all will be well once again. Are the countries of Scandinavia especially homogenous? And if so, I mean, I know there's been recent immigration and changes, I think, in all three. How much is that destabilizing that culture?
I sometimes think that one of the reasons why Sweden, for example, which has been neutral, not been at war for since the end of the Napoleonic Wars, that's over 200 years, been neutral for over 200 years. Norway and Denmark were invaded during the Second World War, but they're largely very peaceful corners of the world. And I think that because they've been a rather obscure corner of the world, they've been left to get on with creating a kind of ideal society, or to aim at creating an ideal society. And that, of course, is helped by being homogenous. There is no competing religion. There's no competing ideas of what good ethical standards are. They've been very welcoming to other cultures. But I do think it's an experiment, and I do think it'll be very interesting to see how it turns out, because it has introduced tensions which were not present before.
Is there that sort of cultural fear about retaining what is Swedish, what is Danish, what is inherently Scandinavian about the culture that, for example, there has been in places like France and in England? Is that happening now due to that immigration?
There are exactly the same sorts of anxieties arising, and the large number of Muslim immigrants. This is not something that's been part of their culture. They have a culture that more closely resembles the sort of cultures that we had in Europe in the 1940s and 50s as regards women's role, for example. There are elements in the society that are not comfortable with this. But I think that these societies feel so strong, they're so confident of the strength of their values, of the strength of their decency, that they do truly believe that decency will survive every challenge to it.
I want to go back to something you said early on that struck me, which was that despite the fact that you've been in Norway for more than 30 years now, that you can look still at 5 or 6-year-old Norwegian children and think they're more Scandinavian or Norwegian than you'll ever be. What is it that you see in them that makes you think that?
I don't know. It's almost like the mystery of belonging. There's something always mystical about it. I don't think I'm necessarily typical in that respect, because a lot of people think that if you have a passport, that makes you that nationality. Despite that you may speak with a foreign accent and have a different, come from a different culture. But to me, it's a rather profound thing. I want, it's nothing to do with blood. It's nothing like that. It's just it's almost indescribable.
Mm-hmm.
For example, that you come from a very small linguistic community. You know what your status is as a world power. You know what your history is. And yet, if you come, as I do, from a fairly large country, 60 million people, I can never feel that. I can never know what it really feels like to know from birth onwards that you're part of a very small linguistic and cultural community. Scandinavians would typically act very sort of modestly. They will appear culturally very modest and rather play up to the role of being, well, we're only small, we'll just take the lead from the big boys and so on. And yet beneath that, you find there is a completely different level of pride in their own achievements and a love of their own sporting heroes and their own singers and actors. And they have their own hidden universe, cultural universe, as it were, so they operate on 2 levels, really. They respond to the big one, the world one, the American one, the British one, the French one, but there's another level which is largely hidden, but which contains all the same elements, a complete pantheon of film stars, complete pantheon of rock stars, of gifted young musicians, of writers and so on, who never really penetrate outside the borders of their own communities.
Well, that's America getting back at you for ABBA. That's our revenge. All right, Robert, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
That was Robert Ferguson joining us from Oslo. His new book is called Scandinavians: In Search of the Soul of the North. Alexandra Alter is here now to talk about what's going on in the literary world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
What's the news?
So we have an update on the Milo Yiannopoulos book, which we discussed last week. He had a rally on Friday, as we mentioned, sort of in front of Simon & Schuster to protest the fact that they canceled his book contract. And he self-published the book last week. So it was sort of a half publicity stunt promoting the book and half kind of anti-Simon & Schuster rally. And he announced that he is filing a $10 million lawsuit against Simon & Schuster. He's saying it was an illegal breach of contract when they canceled his contract. At the same time, there are some news outlets reporting what his first week of sales are like. He was claiming through his publicist that he had sold 100,000 copies and sold out of the book immediately. Mm-hmm. The numbers that came into NPD BookScan look a little different than that. They reported that he sold 18,268 copies of the book in the U.S. in its first week. And that includes sales through Amazon. So it's not necessarily, the case that bookstores aren't selling the book, but Amazon is. Those numbers do reflect Amazon print sales. So his response to that was, we're selling a lot through wholesale, and we didn't get the books out quickly enough. That doesn't capture everything.
Are bookstores carrying it?
I doubt that independents are carrying it. It was on Barnes & Noble's website for sale. I don't know if it's in their physical stores. I mean, independents were one of the first groups to kind of criticize Simon & Schuster for publishing it in the first place, given his extreme right-wing stances. Independent stores and authors were all sort of attacking Simon & Schuster for promoting somebody who has those kinds of views. So I would be surprised if many of them were carrying it. So it'll be interesting to see sort of what the tail is of this book. It looks like it already dropped off pretty quickly on Amazon. Of course, he's a genius at drumming up publicity, positive and negative, or mostly negative, at least, in certain outlets. So that could, again, give him another boost down the line. And then another interesting development in publishing this week, we learned that two publishing industry veterans who are proven hitmakers, Deb Futter and Jamie Robb, who were at Grand Central Publishing for many years and had a number of successes there, left the company earlier this year in January, and many people in the industry were surprised because they'd had such a good run there.
Mm-hmm. And that's part of Hachette.
It's part of Hachette. And there's a lot of movement in the publishing industry. Personnel moves are very common. People jump around from house to house, but they didn't have anything lined up. So that was sort of the surprising part for people. So they have teamed up again, and they are starting their own publishing division at Macmillan. It's called Celadon Books, and they'll be doing fiction and nonfiction. It'll be interesting to see if they manage to steal away any of their old authors. Jamie Robb published Nicholas Sparks, who's a huge, obviously, bestseller, and Nelson DeMille. Deb Futter acquired and edited Scott Turow. They published at Grand Central Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert, Al Franken, Amy Sedaris, all these big names. So they might try to poach a little, or they might start building a list from scratch. Of course, even with their track records, it's hard to start a new imprint, especially in this climate. I mean, publishing is a stable business right now, but it's not booming. I mean, they'll be scrambling for the same kind of books that other imprints are trying to get. Within their company, they have this kind of broad definition of fiction and nonfiction, so it's not like they're carving out a really kind of distinct niche for themselves.
Is it commercial literary?
Commercial/literary is what they're looking for. Deb Futter said, she acquired and edited Noah Hawley's Before the Fall, which turned out to be a huge hit last year. It's a smart thriller, and it appealed to all kinds of readers. So she'll be looking for books like that. But again, these experimental imprints, when they start up, it takes them a while to prove themselves, to get going. They don't have a backlist to fall back on of sales. So there's often a lot of pressure to produce a hit, and it can take a while. Recently we saw Blue Rider Press close down at Penguin.
And that was David Rosenthal's imprint.
It was David Rosenthal's imprint, and it was started in 2011, so it wasn't around for that long. They I felt, did kind of create a space for themselves. They had a number of successful music memoirs, and that kind of became part of their business. But again, it's so competitive. And at a big house, a big company like Penguin Random House, somebody probably looked at Blue Rider and said, you know what, they're not doing anything that different, or they're overlapping with this or that imprint. So it's hard. We'll be watching what they acquire, though. I'm curious because I think both of them have interesting taste and a pretty good eye for potential hits. So it'll be interesting to see what they acquire.
All right. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thank you.
Joining us now, my colleagues Greg Coles, John Williams, and Jennifer Salai. Hi, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
All right, let's talk about what we're reading, and we're going to start with John because he's flipping through a book, looking he's studying what he's reading and trying to remember desperately what he's reading.
No, I'm a good student this week. I finally finished and do want to mention briefly again Haldor Laxness's novel Under the Glacier, which is sort of linked to the other book I'm reading because it's about religion and it's about an emissary, a Christian emissary who goes to the countryside in this glacier in Iceland and tries to find out if this church is properly burying its dead. And there's a lot of sort of dialogue between characters and it's very lightly comic. And I would say being, I think, probably the only Icelandic novel I've read, I'd say start with the nation's literature there. And then I'm continuing into Patricia Lockwood's Priest Daddy, which I mentioned on the show last week, which is her memoir about growing up with her father in the Midwest and her mother and her sister. Her father was a married Catholic priest. This book, I started to recommend it last week. Now I can wholeheartedly say that this is one of the funniest books I've ever read. I mean, I've been laughing out loud on the subway all week.
Those who follow your Twitter feed know that.
which makes me feel like a crazy person when I laugh in public. But it's so funny. And I thought it was going to be more of a continuous story, but it more sort of dips into these anecdotes about her growing up and describes her family. And she's great with figurative language. She's a poet and she's a terrific writer. But she's also just very interested in making us enjoy the comic nature of her family's life. So she writes this about, I have to read this about her father playing guitar when she was growing up. She says, "It sounds like a whole band dying in a plane crash in the year 1972. He plays the guitar like he's trying to take off women's jeans or like he's standing nude in the middle of a thunderstorm and calling down lightning to strike his pecs. It's not bad exactly, it just makes you doubt your version of reality. He plays a lot of notes very fast and all in a row, but they don't seem to have any relation to one another. I've never heard him play an actual song, not even by accident, and I've made something of a study of his style over the years. Some people are, through whatever mystifying means, able to make the guitar talk. My father can't do that, but he can do the following. 1. Make the guitar squeal. 2. Make the guitar say no. 3. Make the guitar falsely confess to murder. 4. Make the guitar stage a filibuster where it reads The Hunt for Red October out loud." So that's just a little taste, but it's literally like that on every page. And she's just so energetic and so funny. So I'm about halfway through it, and I'm going to tear through the rest before the weekend, probably.
All right, Jen
So I know that Jen is going to change the mood.
Funny, yes.
Team change. Speaking of music,
we were talking about this before the podcast, hoping that John would go after me instead of before me because my books are.
I offered.
It's true. You did offer. Because my books are really not funny at all, not joyful at all. But I will say that I have been on an Emmanuel Carrère kick because of our colleague, Barry Guin, who's a big fan.
You're making him happy because that book, Lives Other Than My Own, sat on my desk for a year after Barry lent it to me, and I failed to open it. And so you're redeeming.
Well, I think he took it away from you,
yes.
And then he gave it to me, and then it sat on my desk for about 3 months until
Lives
I finally...
Other Than My Own, that's the one that's nominally about the tsunami?
That is nominally about the tsunami. So it starts off because Carrère and his partner and their 2 children from previous relationships are vacationing in Sri Lanka in 2004. And just by a series of small decisions they made, it meant that when the tsunami hit, they weren't affected. They were safe in a hotel that was on higher ground. But they got to know some families who were affected. And so at the beginning, the story seems to be about this couple they meet who lost their very young daughter in the tsunami. And then, though, within about, I'd say maybe 30 pages, they return to France. They start to get on with their lives. And his partner, Hélène, her own sister, dies because of a recurrence of cancer. And she dies very young at the age of, I think, 33. And so then the book becomes sort of the story about the sister who was a debt court judge, and then also about this other debt court judge whom she had a very intense friendship with that was totally platonic. And then it also becomes the story of Carrère's own attempts to essentially grow up and have a sustaining relationship with another person. So it's sort of this book that you think starts out one way and then it turns into something totally different.
I'm going to take it back now.
Okay. I highly recommend it.
I already ordered a copy
great.
last week based on your recommendation.
It's really great. And then after that, actually,
But I feel like as part of our department, you should put it on your desk for 4 months. And then
Well, I probably
read
will.
it.
That's what I do anyway, usually when I order new things.
After this book, I started reading The Adversary, which is probably the book I think he's perhaps most famous for, which is a true story about a man in France, Jean-Claude Roman. And it was a big tabloid story in the 90s. He essentially led this double life for 18 years where he had pretended to the world to be this upstanding citizen, this very prestigious doctor who worked at the WHO. He had a wife and kids and, seemed like a very respectable member of the community. And then after 18 years, he killed his entire family. And then he killed his parents.
All right, pass me that one too.
Yeah. So it's a very different kind of book. And I would recommend that one as well. But I actually think that even though the plot of that one sounds just so much more sort of obvious and graspable, and I think you could throw any writer on the subject and it would be an interesting book.
Wait, was he in fact all of those things and he just snapped? Or did he
He was
have
not
all
a doctor.
hidden
Don't
life?
give it away.
Well, this
Stop that, Greg.
This won't give it away. I will say at the very beginning, you learn pretty much immediately that he never even took his medical exams in school. And he was in med school with the woman who became his wife. So the way in which he starts to lie from the very beginning is kind of astounding.
Greg,
On that
where's your
cheerful note.
where's your mood this week, Greg?
I will bring it back to the comic. In recent weeks, I've talked a lot about older books that I'd been reading for this segment, but this week I'm back to new publications. 2 books. One of them, I'll just mention quickly because our review has not yet appeared, but it's Danzy Senna's new novel. It's called New People. It really comes out, I think, at the beginning of August, and essentially, it's a story of racial identity. It centers on a very light-skinned couple who are engaged, and it's the story of the woman in that couple who is very kind of drawn to Black culture and questions her place in Black identity. So it's those are the issues that it deals with, and I won't say more than that about it right now because
we'll double back at some point.
Yeah, but a review that has just gone online and will be in an upcoming issue is our review of Matthew Clam's new novel, Who is Rich? Clam, our listeners may remember, made a big noise with a story collection called Sam the Cat. That came out 17 years ago. It's hard to believe. He was, at the turn of the century, he was considered kind of one of the hot young writers. He published stories in The New Yorker. I think The New Yorker picked him as one of the best young writers. That collection came out, and then he just kind of disappeared. There was no new book after that, and it's been 17 years, and finally, here's his first novel. It's called Who is Rich? The story it tells is your standard kind of love triangle story of marital infidelity. The title is a bit of a play on words. The protagonist's name is Rich, and so Who is Rich? It's this character study of this kind of schlumpy, he's an artist type. He's a cartoonist and illustrator, and he has an affair with somebody at an artist's colony. Clam is a very funny writer. He's very good on kind of the impossibility of having it both ways. So he really loves his wife, although they've been married a number of years now. They have 2 children. He's a doting, devoted father to those kids, and there are lovely passages in this book about kind of the energy that he draws from them. But his marriage is more or less sexless at this point. He resents his wife for the lack of physical contact. He has no intention of giving up his marriage, but he's kind of looking for more at the same time. And so it's, it goes into John Updike territory. It's not breaking new ground. Oh no, it's certainly not a sexless book. The play on words in the title, Who is Rich? His partner in the affair, this woman named Amy. She's a student at this artist's colony that he goes to, and she's married to a hedge fund guy or a financier of some sort who's a millionaire many times over, if not a billionaire, and so it's partly about class resentment as well. So it's a lot of fun. You can just kind of tear through it. It's very well written.
Sex and Class Resentment.
I've been planning to read that next, although I sometimes
a comedy of sex and class resentment.
I don't want to, I don't want to follow you too closely on the podcast. I need fresh stuff to talk about. Pamela, what do you have over there?
Well, it's not new. It's new-ish. Tana French's most recent novel, The Trespasser, which is my entry into Tana French territory. I've been meaning to read her for a while, and I sort of, very studiously meant to start at the beginning with the first book. But when I finished The Woman in White, I was kind of adrift for a day, which for me is like a long time to go without having landed on the next book. But it was so hard to follow, and I thought, well, the only thing I know about what I want to read next is that it should not be gripping, because it was so time-consuming reading that Woman in White. Like I would wake up accidentally at 5 a.m. and then just be like, well, it's time to, I'll just stay awake and read The Woman in White. And yet here I am reading a thriller, and it is
you really
a page-turner.
You let yourself down in this.
I did. Well, I think it's one of those things. It's like when your kids finish Harry Potter, then there's a real conundrum, like what to do with the post-Harry Potter reader, because it's like, how can you possibly match? And I remember with my oldest child, the thing that did it was the whole Oz series. But again, like, how do you match The Woman in White? Which I think that, having been away from it now for a week, I can say is probably going to be in my top 10 novels. It was that good. And so this is sort of doing the trick for now. It's, she writes these detective kind of crime thrillers set in Dublin. And I think the shtick, although I'm pretty sure her thing is that they're all set in the same precinct.
Is it a series?
It's not a series, but it's like a linked world where you have a different narrator for each book. And this book is narrated by a young woman who is half, we think, Jamaican and half Irish, raised by a single mother. And one of the things I like about the book so far, and I'm not yet halfway through it, is that Tana French, as a narrator, establishes certain things that the reader knows, but that even her protagonist, who is in fact narrating the story, doesn't know. So you know more than she does, or you see things as the reader that that your narrator is not seeing, and it takes a while to get onto that. But that she's not seeing them because of her own background and her own sort of prejudices and way of looking at the world. So it's kind of multi-layered in that respect, and so far so good.
I've been looking for an entree into her stuff too, so you'll have to tell me when you finish it whether this is the one to...
Well, Radhika Jones, who is sort of going about this more systematically, started at the beginning. So she can tell you about book 1, and I'll tell you about, I think this is book 6, and then you can make your choice.
I'll sit you both down.
Yes. All right, guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.